In the marble glow of late Republican Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus strode like a man possessed. To the casual eye, he already had everything a Roman could possibly desire. Estates sprawling across Italy, vaults brimming with silver, clients who bowed to him in gratitude or fear. He was, quite literally, the richest man in Rome. Yet behind the gleam of gold lay a gnawing wound: respect, the one currency Crassus could never purchase. Crassus had learned early that catastrophe bred opportunity. During the chaos of Sulla's civil wars, while others saw flames consuming Rome, Crassus saw profit. Properties seized from the proscribed, men condemned as enemies of the state, were sold for pennies, and Crassus bought them all. He organized his own private fire brigade, a grotesque enterprise in which his men would wait for houses to burn nearly to the ground before offering to buy them at insultingly low prices. Only after ownership passed into Crassus's hands would the flames be doused. By such ruthless opportunism, he transformed devastation into empire. Brick by brick, estate by estate, his wealth swelled. Yet wealth bought only envy and suspicion, not honor. Among soldiers who bled for Rome, Crassus was a parasite, a man who made gold from ashes while others made glory from blood. In 71 BCE, Crassus found his chance to reforge his image. A slave revolt had erupted under a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus. Rome reeled in humiliation as rebel armies carved through legion after legion. At last, Crassus was entrusted with supreme command. His discipline was iron, his punishments merciless. When a cohort fled the battlefield, Crassus revived an ancient horror: decimation. Every 10th soldier beaten to death by his comrades. Terror restored order, and soon Spartacus and his rebels were crushed. But even here, Crassus was denied the laurels he craved. As he prepared a grand triumph, Pompey the Great swooped in, slaughtering the last stragglers and claiming the victory as his own. Once again, Crassus's achievements were eclipsed. His name lingered in the shadow of brighter stars. By the mid-1st century BCE, Rome's politics had become a battlefield as bloody as any frontier. Pompey, conqueror of the seas and darling of the Senate; Julius Caesar, rising populist with the loyalty of legions; and Crassus, wealth incarnate. Each man alone was formidable. Together, they were unstoppable. Thus the First Triumvirate was born. To outsiders, it seemed a union of equals, 3 men carving the Republic as though it were a feast laid before them. Yet the truth was crueler. Pompey commanded respect through conquest. Caesar dazzled with charisma and military brilliance. Crassus, though indispensable for his financial muscle, was tolerated rather than admired. Among warriors, he was forever the banker, useful but never glorious. By the time he reached 60, Crassus had tasted every pleasure that money could procure. Yet he remained restless, eaten alive by comparison. Caesar thundered through Gaul, sending wagon loads of plunder back to Rome. Pompey basked in triumphs, his name carved into marble as liberator of the seas. And Crassus? His legacy was a mountain of coin, but no song, no story. No empire conquered bore his name. No man is truly great who is not also feared in war. He once lamented to his circle. For all his cunning in the marketplace, Crassus craved the roar of a battlefield, the immortality that only military glory could bestow. The solution seemed clear. Beyond Rome's eastern frontier stretched Parthia, a glittering empire controlling the arteries of trade. Silk, spices, precious stones flowing from east to west. To Crassus, it was the perfect target. Wealthy, alluring, and, he believed, vulnerable. Conquering it would eclipse Caesar's campaigns, dwarf Pompey's conquests, and cement his name in history. But ambition blurred judgment. Parthia was not Gaul, nor the pirates of the Mediterranean. It was an ancient power, its horsemen unmatched, its generals versed in tactics Rome had never faced. Yet when the Senate hesitated, suspecting his greed, Crassus ignored them. He saw in Parthia a golden horizon, a chance to silence every sneer, to seize the honor denied him for decades. Thus began preparations for one of Rome's most disastrous campaigns. In Crassus's mind, it would be his masterpiece, the final chapter of a career defined by wealth, but starved of respect. In truth, it would be the path to ruin, paved by arrogance, crowned in molten gold. The year was 55 BCE. Crassus entered Syria as governor, not with the dignity of an administrator, but with the swagger of a conqueror. His eyes were already fixed eastward on the shining prize of Parthia. Behind him lay Rome, suspicious of his motives. Before him stretched an empire older than the Republic itself. He had not come to govern. He had come to plunder. At Antioch, Crassus wasted no time. He began assembling a colossal army, 7 legions, nearly 40,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 4,000 light troops. It was one of the greatest expeditionary forces Rome had ever committed to the east. At his side was his beloved son, Publius Crassus, a commander hardened under Caesar in Gaul. Father and son believed they were about to carve a dynasty of glory across Mesopotamia. Every expense was poured into the preparations. Siege engines rolled from Roman workshops. Columns of supply wagons lined the roads. To Crassus, victory seemed inevitable. Had not Rome always crushed the so-called barbarians? Had not discipline and steel broken every foe? But not all voices shared his confidence. Artemidorus, an ally in the region, urged him to avoid a direct march through the desert and instead hug the fertile river valleys where supplies and water were abundant. King Artavasdes of Armenia even offered an alternative: join forces with his cavalry and strike Parthia from the north, where the terrain would cripple their horsemen. Crassus scoffed. To him, such advice smacked of timidity. Rome's legions were invincible. Why crawl along rivers or rely on barbarian allies when he could march like a thunderbolt into Parthian heartland? His hubris blinded him to the truth. The Parthians were no scattered tribes, but a kingdom that had fought empires before. Across the Euphrates, General Surena, commander of Parthia's forces, studied the Roman invasion with cold precision. Barely 30 years old, he was already a legend, brilliant, audacious, and fluent in the psychological art of war. He understood what Crassus did not, that Rome's heavy infantry, unmatched in forests and fields, was a blunt instrument in the open desert. Surena devised a strategy of seduction and exhaustion. His men would skirmish, retreat, and vanish, luring the Romans deeper into barren plains. Each mile forward would stretch Crassus's supply lines thinner. Each day under the pitiless sun would sap his soldiers' strength. Unlike the Romans, the Parthians thrived in this environment. Their cavalry moved like water across the sands, horse archers capable of loosing arrows from impossible distances. They carried not just quivers, but endless reserves supplied by camel trains that shadowed their movements. Where Rome sought a decisive battle, Surena sought to bleed them slowly. As spring of 53 BCE dawned, Crassus crossed the Euphrates at Zogma. The first weeks seemed to justify his confidence. Small towns yielded at the mere sight of Rome's standards. Garrison posts fell without resistance. His legions, gleaming in their armor, marched proudly across the flat expanse of Mesopotamia. But soon, the desert began to speak. Roman scouts caught glimpses of distant riders. Parthian horsemen who appeared on ridges, then disappeared into the horizon. Supply trains were ambushed under moonlight. Camp sentries whispered of phantom movements in the dunes, robbing the legions of sleep. By day, the heat was merciless, armor turning into ovens against their skin. By night, the cold bit into weary bones. Soldiers cursed the endless horizon, featureless and empty, where every shadow might conceal an enemy. Already, the desert had claimed its first victims. Men collapsed from heat stroke, beasts of burden dying in the sand. When contact finally came, it was never in the form Rome expected. A column would be harried by arrows from riders too swift to catch. A cohort sent in pursuit would return bloodied and broken. Their quarry vanished into the desert haze. The Romans soon realized their shields, designed to deflect spears and swords, were ill-suited against a ceaseless rain of arrows. Each wound festered in the heat, swelling with infection. Morale began to fray. Still Crassus pressed onward. His pride would not allow retreat. He believed that once Surena was forced into open battle, Roman steel would prevail. Yet every step carried his legions farther from supply lines, deeper into a land where Rome's strength turned to weakness. At last, near the town of Carrhae, word came that the Parthian army was approaching in force. Crassus exhaled in relief. To him, this was the long-awaited climax, the decisive clash that would wash away weeks of harassment and prove Rome's supremacy. He arranged his army for battle, legions in the center, cavalry on the flanks, standards lifted high. At his right, Publius and his cavalry awaited the charge. The desert morning shimmered with heat as they braced for combat. Then across the horizon, the Parthians appeared. Not in disorganized bands, but as a glittering tide of horsemen, their armor flashing like mirrors in the sun. At their head rode Surena, orchestrating a formation Rome had never faced. No heavy infantry lines, no vulnerable center, only endless cavalry moving as one. The trap was closing. Dawn broke over the Mesopotamian desert on June 9th, 53 BCE. Crassus's legions stood in traditional array, heavy infantry forming the steel heart, cavalry bracing the wings, light troops scattered before them. Standards gleamed, shields interlocked, the very image of Roman might. Then came the sound, not the clash of swords, but the hiss of thousands of arrows slicing through the sky. The Parthians had unleashed their storm. Unlike the foes Rome had faced before, these archers did not exhaust their quivers. Camel trains followed in their wake, delivering an endless supply of arrows that rained down like a living tempest. Roman shields groaned under the barrage. The testudo formation, that proud tortoise of interlocked shields, held for a time. But arrows found the smallest gaps, piercing arms, legs, and faces. Men fell screaming, not from one decisive blow, but from the relentless rhythm of wounds accumulating hour after hour. On the right wing, young Publius Crassus could endure no more. Trained under Caesar, filled with the fire of youth, he yearned to silence the torment. He led his cavalry in a bold charge against what seemed the Parthian center. For a moment, it looked as though Rome might break through. But Surena had anticipated this. The cataphracts, Parthian heavy cavalry clad head to toe in scale armor, absorbed the assault like an iron wall. Then horse archers circled, loosing arrows into the exposed flanks of Publius's men. Surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from the main army, Publius fought with desperate courage. Yet valor was no match for strategy. One by one, his men fell beneath the arrows. When at last Publius collapsed, the Parthians took his head, fixing it to a spear. They paraded it before the Roman line, and Crassus the richest man in Rome, stood frozen as he watched the face of his son, his heir, his pride, swaying above the enemy ranks. The sight shattered the army's spirit. Crassus himself, once stern and calculating, now mumbled incoherent orders, overcome with grief. The legions, still disciplined but bleeding morale, struggled to hold formation. The arrows did not stop. Hour after hour, the Parthians circled, striking at will, retreating beyond reach. Roman cavalry, too few and too slow, could not retaliate. The infantry, masters of close combat, found themselves impotent, their swords useless against enemies who would not come near. Heat bore down. Thirst clawed at their throats. Wounds festered in the sun. For the first time in generations, Rome's legions, the terror of the world, felt powerless. As night fell, the battlefield was a graveyard of corpses. Crassus ordered a retreat toward the city of Carrhae, hoping its walls and water would provide safety. But the march collapsed into chaos. Exhausted soldiers abandoned shields and weapons in the sand. Wounded men begged for help, only to be left behind. The Parthians stalked them even in darkness, torches flickering on distant ridges, the sound of hooves haunting the night. Thousands perished before dawn, either cut down in the confusion or succumbing to exhaustion. By the time the remnants stumbled into Carrhae, nearly half the army was gone. Standards were lost, discipline broken, and hope extinguished. Within the city, Crassus was no longer the man who had crossed the Euphrates with dreams of empire. He was bent, hollow-eyed, consumed by grief for Publius and the enormity of his failure. The banker who had sought to buy immortality with conquest had instead purchased humiliation and ruin. Around him, the survivors whispered of betrayal by their commander, of curses from the gods, of Rome's hubris finally punished. The legions that had once marched with iron confidence now huddled like refugees, awaiting annihilation. Outside the walls, Surena encircled the city, patient as the desert itself. He knew his victory was complete. What remained was not to fight, but to humiliate, to turn Crassus's arrogance into a lesson the world would never forget. Dawn broke over Carrhae with a cruel stillness. The survivors of Crassus's army, huddled within the city walls, were hollow-eyed with despair. Food was scarce, water scarcer. Beyond the walls, Parthian banners flickered in the desert wind. Escape was impossible. Then came Surena's offer, a parley under the safety of truce. He proposed terms for withdrawal. The legions could march home if they acknowledged Parthia's victory. For Crassus, broken by grief and haunted by the gaze of his son's severed head, this seemed salvation. His officers pleaded with him to refuse. "Do not trust them," they warned. "This is not Rome. Honor means nothing here." But Crassus, desperate to salvage what remained, clung to hope. He could not face returning to Rome with nothing but ashes and disgrace. Thus, in the no-man's land between armies, Crassus rode out with a small escort to meet Surena. What happened next remains clouded in the mists of conflicting accounts. Some say treachery was premeditated, that Surena never intended negotiation. Others whisper that tensions flared, words twisted, hands reached for swords, and blood spilled. What is certain is this: the parley ended in violence. Roman officers were cut down, and Crassus was seized, bound, and dragged before the Parthian general. The richest man in Rome, who had commanded 7 legions, now stood powerless, dust clinging to his once proud armor. Surena might have killed him swiftly. A sword across the throat, a spear through the chest. Such endings were common on the battlefield. But Surena understood that this was no ordinary captive. Crassus was greed incarnate, the man who had invaded Parthia not for security, not for Rome, but for gold. His death needed to be more than execution. It had to be a symbol. Before a gathering of Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers, Surena pronounced his judgment. The man who had worshipped wealth above all else would be made to choke upon it. Craftsmen were summoned. Gold, that radiant metal for which Crassus had lived his life, was placed into crucibles and set upon the fire. Slowly, as the flames roared, it melted into a glowing liquid, brilliant, searing, deadly. Crassus was forced to his knees. Soldiers held his mouth open. The molten gold was lifted high, shimmering like sunlight in a bowl. Then it was poured. The liquid fire scorched his lips, his throat, his very insides. He gagged, choked, convulsed. Flesh burned from within. Those who watched never forgot the smell, the sound. The richest man in Rome transformed into a grotesque effigy of his own greed. The spectacle was deliberate. Rome's survivors were made to watch, to carry the memory back westward. Parthian nobles witnessed it as proof that even the mightiest enemy could be brought low by arrogance. In that moment, Crassus was more than a defeated general. He was a warning, his death crafted as carefully as a message carved in stone. The Parthians did not stop there. Crassus's head was severed and sent to King Orodes II. Legend claims it was brought onto the stage during a performance of Euripides's Bacchae, presented as the head of Pentheus, the doomed king torn apart by his own hubris. The audience roared with laughter. Rome's greatest banker became a prop in a foreign theater, mocked before strangers. Back in Rome, the news fell like thunder. The illusion of Roman invincibility cracked. The Senate trembled, Pompey and Caesar turned upon each other, and civil war loomed. Crassus, in seeking glory, had instead fractured the fragile balance of the Republic. The molten gold, whether literal or embellished by legend, endured as a metaphor across centuries. To Romans, it was a tale of disgrace. To Parthians, a triumph. To historians, a moral etched in fire. That greed, pursued beyond all measure, becomes its own executioner. When word of Carrhae reached Rome, the city reeled. An entire army annihilated, standards lost, survivors enslaved in distant lands, and the richest man in Rome executed in a manner so grotesque, it seemed less history than nightmare. For centuries, Rome had cultivated the myth of invincibility. Its legions were iron, its generals unconquerable, its republic destined for dominion. But now, across the eastern deserts, that myth lay shattered. Senators whispered of omens, priests declared the gods had turned against Rome, and citizens muttered that perhaps the Republic's arrogance had finally found its punishment. The news was more than humiliation. It was destabilization, for Crassus's death did not end with his body. It unbalanced the fragile architecture of Roman politics. The First Triumvirate, Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, had been a pact of necessity, not friendship. Pompey brought prestige, Caesar brought charisma, Crassus brought wealth. Together they held Rome in their grip. But now the banker was gone. With Crassus's fortune and influence removed, Pompey and Caesar no longer had a mediator. Their alliance dissolved into rivalry. Pompey drew closer to the Senate, presenting himself as the defender of tradition. Caesar, fresh from his triumphs in Gaul, returned with legions devoted not to Rome, but to him personally. The Republic strained under the weight of two titans circling for dominance. Without Crassus's presence, there was no balance, only collision. Meanwhile, the disaster haunted Rome's military consciousness. The Parthians had shown that Rome was not invincible, that its rigid formations could be undone by mobility, by patience, by a storm of arrows that never ceased. For decades after, generals studied Carrhae with dread. Survivors carried the memory like a scar. Some were settled deep in Parthian lands, absorbed into foreign villages, their Roman identities eroded across generations. Others staggered home with tales of thirst, of endless arrow fire, of Crassus's final humiliation. These stories spread, whispered in markets and taverns, embedding fear of the East into Rome's very psyche. Carrhae was not just a military defeat. It was psychological warfare that endured long after the battlefield had fallen silent. The deeper legacy of Crassus's death was not in Parthia, but in Rome. With Pompey and Caesar unchained, civil war became inevitable. In 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, a declaration of war against the Republic itself. Pompey fled, raising his own forces. Battles erupted not in foreign deserts, but on Roman soil, Roman against Roman, until Pompey fell and Caesar stood alone. The Republic, already weakened by decades of corruption, could not survive the strain. What followed was dictatorship, assassinations, more civil wars, and finally, the birth of an empire under Augustus. Crassus, in his hunger for a crown of glory, had unwittingly set this chain in motion. By seeking to equal Caesar and Pompey, he instead removed the very balance that kept them from tearing Rome apart. His molten death was not just the end of one man. It was the spark that consumed a republic. The manner of Crassus, death echoed louder than his life. Historians and philosophers seized upon it as allegory. Plutarch described it as poetic justice, the man who worshipped wealth, forced to drink it. Dio Cassius pondered whether the story was literal or symbolic, but admitted its truth as metaphor. For generations, artists and poets retold the image. The mouth that spoke of conquest, silenced by liquid fire. The throat that craved power melted from within. Crassus's end became less an event than a parable, proof that greed, untempered, consumes its bearer. Even now, across centuries, the image persists. The golden death of Crassus warns that ambition without wisdom destroys not only the man, but the world around him. His molten throat whispers across time. That conquest for pride is ruin, that wealth without honor is ash, and that hubris is the swiftest road to annihilation. Marcus Licinius Crassus rose from fire and ashes, built an empire of coin, crushed rebellions, and stood beside the greatest names of his age. Yet in the desert of Carrhae, his fortune meant nothing. His arrogance fed the flames of Parthian vengeance, and gold, the god he served, became his executioner. His death unbalanced Rome, tearing open the path to civil war. His molten legacy still burns in history as both horror and warning. The richest man in Rome found the only treasure he could not escape, a crown of gold, forged in fire, swallowed in death.